Hi there, you are watching Caitlin Solomon's report on the history of the kimono, and I just want to start off by explaining to you that the word kimono means something worn in Japanese and was used to describe to Westerners the difference between their pants style of clothing versus the Japanese robe style. For our first segment of the kimono history, we're going to be talking about what the Japanese wore prior to the 6th century. Now, in my opinion, it was very resembling of the Native Americans because they wore coats and pretty much any animal skins or plants to make skirts around their waist and kind of shawl like garments around their shoulders. And in the northern climates of Japan, where it's colder, I thought that the Japanese looked very similar to the Eskimos because of the fur that they would use to keep their body warm and away from the harsh winter winds. Now we're going to be talking about the 6th and 10th century Japanese clothing, which was very similar to that of the Chinese dynasty because the Japanese were completely enamored with the Chinese and saw them as the highest and most supreme civilized country out there in that time. So now we're looking at the Japanese clothing, and it consisted of two parts, an upper and lower. The upper part was a shirt similar to present-day kimono, only shorter, which was crossed left over right. This style of crossing the kimono left over right has continued to today. The lower part for men consisted of pants that were not form-fitting, very loose, and for women there were typically pants underneath a skirt, which with a series of robes. Now, in these Japanese clothing, you cannot see the kimono worn by the nobility because they were worn as undergarments. However, for the working and lower classmen, you can see this because they were out in the field and could not wear as many layers as the nobility. Now we're going to be looking at the Heian period, which is when the Japanese began to deviate away from their Chinese influence. During this period, the Japanese began creating the kimono from one piece of fabric, whereas before we saw the kimono in two layers, a shirt and pants slash skirt. We now see the kimono forming one uniform robe with varying lengths. During the Heian period, it was not uncommon to see women wearing as much as 10 layers of kimono with exaggerated hems, meaning that the kimono would reach and trail to the ground for several feet. Along with this, we started a tradition where the Japanese cut the shoulders of the outer kimono and tied them together with strings so that they would reveal the under kimono of the woman. Moving on from the Heian period, we have the Kamakura period, which is when the Japanese began to get rid of the multiple layers of kimono for the lower classmen. They thought that simplicity was better so that the robes would not get in their way. However, the layers of kimono were reserved for the nobility because they had the leisure to carry on such elaborate dresses. Along with this, it became popular for high ranking women to wear veils over their hair and faces. It was also not uncommon for a woman to pick up the back side of her kimono, technically it'd be the train of the kimono that lay on the ground, and put this over her hair. For the men, we also see less layers in their clothing. We see the warrior class wearing more protective armor and medals out in public. Along with this, with any standard kimono, whether formal or informal, we also see the introduction of bright colors into the pattern scheme. I'm tying in the Muromachi period with the Kamakura period because it pretty much undid everything that occurred in the Kamakura period. For example, we went back from seeing the simple kimono in the Kamakura period to now more elaborate kimono in layers that were seen in the Heian period. In addition to this, the bright colors were also very popular during the Muromachi period, and men continued to wear heavy armor for protection going outside and showing their manliness that they were true warriors. Hope you guys all just enjoyed that short, brief little quiz. I pretty much wanted to make it straightforward for you guys. So now we're looking at the 15th century. This is pretty much when our typical average day, current day, as in today's modern times, kimono was created. They were created actually back in the 15th century. And this is pretty much all I really have on the 15th century. So this is the main important part I want you to take from that is that our modern day kimono was created in the 15th century. Okay, so now I'm just giving you guys a heads up that the Edo period has a lot of information that we're going to be covering and that you'll need to know. So if you haven't taken a break yet, now might be a good time to do so. So looking at the Edo period, we see the government was enforcing a lot more laws restricting on what people could and could not wear. For example, only the nobility were allowed to wear the many layers that were presented in the Heian period. They were very long and heavy and very elaborate. The women during that time period were had to reserve themselves and wear a simple kimono because they were not of nobility. However, when I was looking at the Edo period, I found that men, regardless of their class status, seemed to look very similar, just with different varying of detail in their kimono style. And if they were samurai, obviously they're going to be wearing a lot of armor and look very how do I put this? Very high class. We also have, for the women of the lower class, they were only allowed to wear formal kimono during very, very extremely important occasions, whereas the nobility was just allowed to wear them for every day. We also have during the Edo period, the standard obi was created. Now, for those of you that may not know, for example, I didn't know this before studying the kimono, the obi was created so that the woman's waist would be the central focus of the kimono. Whew, that was a lot of information. So before we get on to the present day kimono, there are just two facts that I thought were important for us to know. First of all, men wore pants until about the 19th century before they switched to the complete kimono robe without pants. In addition to this, women typically wore their hair down until about the 19th century, so it is not common for you to see women with their hair up prior to the 19th century. Now we're going to be looking at the present day kimono. Well, the popularity of the kimono has actually declined since about, I'd say about World War One, pretty much when Western society began to open up the Japanese people to the world around them. For example, we had after World War II, the government tried to force, not heavily, but they wanted the Japanese to adopt Western clothing because they felt that they were way underdeveloped compared to the rest of the world. And for some reason, they thought that by changing their clothing style, they would seem more developed and socialized and civilized. In addition to this, there was a recession in the 1990s, which led to the decline in kimono demand because kimonos are actually very expensive because they are made out of silk. So most women now will rent a kimono for a special occasion. So it's very rare to actually see a woman who owns her own kimono due to the price and expense of a kimono. In addition, the tradition of wearing kimonos has not been carried on through the younger generations. So many women don't know how to put a kimono on.